Happy Thanksgiving, Wizards. It's Dev and Ziggy here. Mtg, we like it at Magic. And today, no matter how crazy your Thanksgiving crew is, I promise you mine's worse. Now, you're correct. I haven't met your uncle, and he might be really, really awful, but at least you're probably still reasonably safe despite all the cutlery around you. Can't say the same at my Thanksgiving, because I've invited all of the Rakdos planeswalkers to come and have some dinner. First things first, man. I know we don't always see eye to eye, but I'm really glad you came over for Thanksgiving, Jerry. For starters, A, my name is Timothy, like I've told you countless times in the past. Second of all, thank you for inviting me. Third of all, the only reason I decided to come is because it turns out that I am one of the more popular characters you've created in a while, and I wanted to come and be on camera. The last time I was on camera, our engagement in the comment section raised by over 10%. But let's actually not talk about work today, Gare Bear. It's Thanksgiving, and I figured a nice thing to do would be to go around the table, just the two of us, and talk about what we're most thankful for. Okay, you're right. It does sound nice. So, I guess I'm thankful that the numbers from 1102 to 1117 were way up for your channel, which is good, but I am concerned about the numbers since then. As a matter of fact, I prepared a list of figures here I'd like to go over real quick. Hey now, you're doing it again. What did I say about talking about work there? Okay, well then fine, you turkey. What are you thankful for? Oh, that's easy. I'm thankful for Boxu. Is that really a Boxu? You know, one of the other reasons that I came, and I didn't tell you, is because I wanted to make sure you didn't spend too much on Thanksgiving dinner. But since you used the code StrictlyBetterMtg10 at checkout at Boxu.com, I know this didn't cost you too much. That's right, Tiny Tim. If you go to Boxu.com and put in the code StrictlyBetterMtg10, you're going to get 10% off of your delicious Japanese snacks. Let's take a look and see what snacks we got this month, Jerry. It's the Hokkaido Holidays Bunch. It means we get things like the Yubari Melon Chocolate Bar, the White Peach Mochi Bars, the Apple Gummy Candies from Hokkaido, the Kanako Black Sesame Soft Candy, the Hokkaido Milk Fumwari Puffs. There's even some really awesome unconventional stuff in here, like the Tokibi Corn Chocolate, which is delicious, or the even somehow more delicious and also unconventional White Chocolate Potato Chips, which you actually get a pretty big thing of. Hey, by the way, I don't actually have like a turkey or dressing or anything like that. I was just planning on eating this Boxu for Thanksgiving, if that's all right with you. Use the link in the description and enter the promo code. It's Strictly Better MTG10. Do it. Get yourself some snacks. They're good. They're delicious snacks. Get you some snacks, but I want to go ahead and start talking about this deck because it's actually kind of near and dear to me. As a content creator, I try to do one of two things most of the time, which is bring you stuff like the tier list. You know, these are the best decks that you can possibly play in Standard. Or on the other hand, I like to bring you the jankiest, dumbest combos that I can possibly dream up because that's fun content. But at the end of the day, I need something enjoyable to play for myself, and that's what this deck has become this season. So I've been really liking this deck this season. It's almost a pet deck of mine, and I was lucky enough that my patrons voted for this to be the next deck tech that we did, probably because I told them that it's the deck that I've been spending most of my free time with. And there's a reason for that, as we'll talk about as we move through this video, and as you'll see in the example game a little bit later. But let's go ahead and talk about all the planeswalkers that's coming to dinner, starting with Grandma Lolth. She gives big hugs because of all them arms and whatnot, but what she mostly does is the spider dance. This is one of the few things that puts creatures on the table in our entire deck, so we need that from time to time for offense or the defense, but it also draws cards, something else that we're not really doing enough of in our Rakdos deck, because it'd be hard to come by a decent card draw. A lot of times in mono black decks, or even the black-white Blood on the Snow decks, this is the only planeswalker that you'll actually see in the entire deck, and those decks get along just fine with this as their only walker, but I want to play more. I want more planeswalkers in my deck, so we're also going to play 2 copies of Hot Cousin Sorin. Why are you looking at your phone? He's looking at his phone. You can't convince me that's not a phone. But anyway, I'm playing a couple of copies of this because it makes flying lifelink blockers. That's usually what they amount to. And this deck really needs some life gain from time to time, it turns out, in order to turn the corner. It's nice to be able to stay alive, so just that lifelink matters. But if we're in the mood to draw even more cards, this will often cost us more than 1 life. But sometimes the +1 won't cost us anything because we hit a land or something. But even if it cost us 3 to 5 or even 6 life, depending on the game state, we are more than likely to draw the card that can turn the game around for us. So don't discount the plus ability, but very often we're going to be minusing this. and then plussing it, and then minusing it. I've also invited Sister Rowan to the party, even though not too many people like her, and we have no way of casting her brother Will in this entire deck. That's right, we're not making treasure tokens or anything, but all I really care about is Rowan in this deck anyway. A 3-mana Planeswalker is good for a few reasons. Comes down early in the game, and if we only have 3 snow lands, we can still get this out of the graveyard after we blood on the snow, and that comes up more often than you think. It's also a reliable source of damage every turn, a way to decrease the cost of spells, and we have a lot of instants and sorceries in this deck. And if you do hit the ultimate, which I've done a buttload of times actually, then you just double up on spells. This is actually a really good walker, even just on its front face, but I'm only going to play the 1 copy of it. Really don't think we need any more. Same is true of Aunt Lilian. I was going to say Mama Lilian, but Professor Onyx is an aunt if I've ever seen one. But in any case, I only want 1 copy of this because it costs so much, and we've already got some 6-drops in the deck. Can't play all the 6-drops. So I really only found room for 1 of this card, but it too is awesome with all the instants and sorceries in the deck. It's especially awesome when the costs are being reduced by the Rowan. You just start slinging spells like crazy. But this too is card draw, which is we need some of, and I mean, I guess with all of our walkers, we have enough card draw at this point. Most of our walkers draw cards, but aside from that, it is also much needed removal in the deck. Just another walker that kind of does a little bit of everything. I love the mono black package of planeswalkers right now, but you add red to the mix and you got a lot of really cool cards out of that. The best being Light Up the Night. Because Rakdos walkers don't just like their meat cooked, they like it burned, and that's what we're going to do in this deck. This isn't the only burn card that we have access to, far from it in fact, but very often this can come along in the late game and just deal like 8 damage to your opponent's face. Then later on you get it out of your graveyard and hit them for another 4, maybe kill one of their creatures. Remember too that this is a decent removal spell against creatures and walkers, because if you target not your opponent with it, it always does 1 more damage than what X is equal to. That means that it's actually a reliable burn spell against creatures a fair amount of the time. But ever since 1995, I've loved ripping a fireball off the top of my deck when I have 10 mana out and the game's at a board stall, and just winning the game right then and there. And you can still do that in Standard thanks to Light Up the Night. But before I get to the rest of the burn spells and stuff that we're playing, I want to go ahead and tell you that we're running 3 Blood on the Snow, because I've already mentioned the card. We've got a lot of planeswalkers in this deck. We don't want to die to creatures. Hence, Blood on the Snow. At least 3 copies of this card. Again, we can't play all the 6-drops in the world, but I do want to run Blood on the Snow because it seems pretty silly to not do that in the deck full of planeswalkers. But in other sweeper news, we're also running 2 copies of Shadow's Verdict because it's a good card. Doesn't hit any of our creatures. I thought about playing things like Sedgemoor Witch in this deck and whatnot, but didn't end up doing that. I felt like Shadow's Verdict was probably the best 5-drop sweeper we have access to because it doesn't kill our planeswalkers. Turns out like other sweepers like Burn Down the House would. So I'm just playing this instead, and it's really good against everything from mono white to mono green, and that's just about all you really have to care about. But like I said, there are other burn spells in this deck. We've got 2 copies of Play with Fire, 3 Spike Field Hazard, 3 Royal Eruption, and 2 Igneous Inspiration. That's a fair number of burn spells when you count them all up and add in the Light Up the Night. 14 to be exact, and we're not even done dealing damage directly to our opponent. We'll talk about that later, probably the weirdest card in the list, but we'll get there. I just wanted to drop a hint. But in any case, these can do all kinds of stuff, from blow up creatures to draw you extra cards like Igneous Inspiration, and it is very important to be able to get into the sideboard in this deck. Royal Eruption can be kicked if you draw it in the late game, or it can just kill small creatures early, or just hit your opponent in the head. Spike Field Hazard can take out things like Shambling Ghast or Eye Twitch without hitting the die triggers on those cards, and it can kill Dry Luminarch Aspirant if you have the mana open before they get to their combat steps. So Spike Field's really good right now too, and Play with Fire. Scries are very important to this deck, but don't be afraid to point this at a creature. There's a couple of other removal spells and important cards in the deck, like the 2 copies of Infernal Grasp, because we need some removal that can hit just about anything. There's a lot of X4s in the format right now, and a lot of our burn removal can't hit that, or it costs a lot, like Light Up the Night cost a fair amount to actually hit a 4 toughness creature. So we're just going to play Infernal Grasp so we can kill those bigger dudes a little bit easier. We've also got 1 spare copy of Go Blank in the main deck here. This was Dread Fugue for a while, but it turns out that Go Blank is just actually one of the better 3-drops that a black deck can play right now, given what the format looks like. A lot of control decks, and even the non-control decks tend to play 4 and 5 drops like nuts, so this is a very valuable card right now, especially given how important graveyards are at the moment. I got a couple of more cards to look at before we get to the lands here. We're playing 3 copies of Reckless Impulse, one of the only other new cards, besides, obviously, Sorin, in this entire deck. But it's a very important card for this deck. I've already said a few times that we have a trouble drawing cards in this thing. I almost used, Investigator's Journal in this deck, but then I remembered that we had access to this amazing card. And it is good, whether you play it on turn 3 like a Is It Mage plays an Expressive Iteration, for instance, to get your land drop for the turn, or you play it on turn 6, after you've already played your Lolth, or maybe you've already played your Blood on the Snow. You need to refill in the mid and late game, and either dropping this off the top of your library when you get it late, or just holding it in your hand until you're starting to run out of cards, and then playing it on turn 6 or 7. All good modes for this card. It effectively draws 2 cards in this deck, and even though there are going to be some times where you play this on turn 4, exile a Blood in the Snow, oh my god, you can't play that. The majority of times where you play this card, it is effectively draw 2 in your Rakdos deck, and that is worth playing. But I am going to have a much harder time justifying the inclusion of the final card in the deck, and I've already told you what this card is. If you come to the Twitch streams, by the way, check that out. You come watch us play some Magic on Twitch, and the, 100 of you that were in the room when I was talking about this card already know about it. You could have been one of those 100 people, but I am playing 3 copies. I'm actually going to say it. I was wondering if this card would actually make it into the video, if I would be bold enough to not cut this card. But I didn't cut this card. We're playing 3 copies of Dogged Pursuit. You'll see in the example game some of the work this card can do. It's amazing in multiples. Pretty decent, especially against certain aggro decks, depending on, again, what the board state looks like. If you can keep the board state relatively clear of big dudes, Dogged Pursuit actually gains you a fair amount of life, and over a certain number of turns, will start to really, really worry a lot of opponents. Just like I said with Rowan, this is a reliable source of damage every single turn, except this is a lot more hard to remove than a Rowan is, and the gaining the life is important as well. There's a very few things in this deck that gain life, but oftentimes playing this deck, and I've played a lot of this deck this season, you'll find yourself in a situation where you get down to like 3-4 life before you can either stabilize the board state or sweep the board or keep your opponent off of playing creatures or otherwise just turn the corner in the traditional way that a control deck does. And this little bit of life over the course of 3 or 4 turns really, really helps out with that, along with some of the other life gain in the deck. So I know I'm not going to convince you that Dogged Pursuit is a good card. There's no way I can do that, even after you see the example game, but just try the card. You don't even have to trust me on it. I was going to say trust me on this. You don't have to do that. Just try the 3 copies of this card out in the deck. If you don't like it after a few games, you can cut it for something else. You can do that, but I want you to at least try. Now here's our mana base. There are 25 lands in this mana base. We need slightly more with all these 5 and 6 drops, so I added a land, but remember there's also a Spikefield Hazard in the deck, giving us a total of about 28 lands. That's not a terrible... You shouldn't run into too many land troubles here, but note that I've also slipped in an Immersturm Skull Cairn so that we can just bolt our opponent with our land sometimes. It seems like a good way to grab a couple of damage, but there's also Faceless Haven and Field of Ruin, mostly for blowing up Faceless Havens. Now our sideboard is actually pretty cut and dried here, but there's a ton of really good options in red and black, so you could do a lot with this board. I ended up on 3 copies of Duress and a copy of Go Blank, mostly against control matchups, but we've got a lot of stuff in here against control. Rowan tends to be decent against control if they can't find an answer for it. Dogged Pursuit will fill out the playset against those dirtily control decks that take a lot of turns, right? But there's some other stuff in here, mostly against aggro, things like Cinderclasm as a 2-of, so we have some really small-scale sweepers against those mono-white matches. Another copy of Royal Eruption. This can come if your opponent has a lot of good targets for it, or even against control sometime if you just want more burn. Soul Shatter is there to either blow up planeswalkers, or if we don't want to die, to, say, an Immersturm Predator, which will happen from time to time. But there's also 2 copies of Ardent Elementalist, because I couldn't make a red-black Blood on the Snow without putting this trick into the deck somewhere. It's a pretty gross trick if you haven't seen it yet. You can basically just use your Blood on the Snow to get back Ardent Elementalist, and then when Ardent Elementalist comes into play, you get your Blood on the Snow back, and you're in a never-ending loop. It's a dumb combo, and I couldn't play this deck without it somewhere in the 75 cards. But aside from that, we've also got a copy of Environmental Sciences, a Mascot Exhibition, and Confront the Past, maybe the most important card in the entire board. Now here are your power rankings. A final score of by the way, no, Tybalt is not in the deck. Sorry about that. But anyway, final score of 68. That is a pretty high score for a deck that's not really on the tournament radar at all, but we do a little bit of everything in this deck. If we come up against a creature-heavy deck, we've got tons of removal spells and obviously sweepers to gain a board advantage over them, drop a planeswalker, ride it to victory, and eventually maybe light up the night their face off. If we're playing, or just use light up the night as a removal spell itself if we have to. If we're playing against control, then suddenly all of our burn spells are still live against them. They just end up going face, and then just like usual, we resolve planeswalkers, kind of win the game that way. And sometimes we can win the game off of like a 10-point light up the night in those situations. Or a dogged pursuit that sits on the table for like 9 turns, which is way more common than you think. I will stop trying to advocate for dogged pursuit. Just try the card. But we've actually got a lot of, cool little niches that we fit into in Standard right now. We are not good in the Epiphany matchup, but if you come up against Mono White or Mono Green or the Humans deck or any of the other Blood on the Snow decks for that matter, you actually have a pretty good chance of winning. Against those other Blood on the Snow decks, it's like playing a control deck. Just go face with all your burn, go face with your Light Up the Nights, and very often you'll win what is effectively a damage race against those decks. And by the way, I guess I won't stop advocating for this card. Dogged Pursuit is really, really good in those matchups. But let's take a look at our example game here so you can see what I'm talking about. This was my favorite game that I recorded out of the many, many games that I've recorded with this deck. Like I said, I play this deck a lot, so I've got a lot of footage, but this was my favorite game because I think it showcases very well what this deck is capable of, what I've been talking about this entire time. We kind of do a little bit of everything in this game. We're in a creature-based matchup here against a humans deck, and our opponent sure does have a lot of very good creatures that they're playing. But that said, we can control the board state early. We were able to sweep the board a number of times, regain control of the board state with our planeswalkers, and even after we have a few turns where we draw lands for 3 or 4 turns in a row, we're still able to do a ton of work with Dogged Pursuit and finish the game off with a huge Light Up the Night. Good game, opponent. Hope you enjoyed this one. I know it's not necessarily the deck tech that you may have been expecting for our second or third deck tech of the season. Normally we're still covering like really hot decks, decks that everyone's talking about at this point in the season. So again, I'm thankful for my patrons for allowing me to talk about a deck that I know not many people are talking about, but a deck that I have loved this season, and I would recommend, if you can try this deck, give it a shot. But that's all I got for this one. Just enjoy your Thanksgiving for me. Like and subscribe if you get a chance, and if you want to, you can do some of this stuff over here. It's just $1 a month to vote on content on the channel. But I'll let you get back to your Thanksgiving celebrations. Appreciate you watching, Wizards. I'm Deb from The Place. You guys spread love and be kind.